In Essential Task 6.2, we are going to outline the process of gestation, talking about the process from conception through birth, talking about some of the things that impact prenatal development. And then we're going to talk about infancy, talking about the maturation of motor skills, reflexes, habituation, and then a concept known as temperament. I definitely think horizontal is the way to go with this concept map. It's 6 columns from left to right, something that I think would be very challenging to do vertically, though I will return back to the task text, allowing you to pause the video before proceeding into the concept map. We'll start with early development, and then, as I alluded to, transition to infancy, kind of in that middle point where you see the term maturation. We will first begin by talking about gestation, which is the development from conception all the way through birth. This class doesn't focus a lot on this, but nevertheless, we still need to clarify some terminology. So, for example, in the first 2 weeks from the moment of conception, at this point in time, we're talking about the zygotic phase. We're talking about simply a fertilized egg. It is at around 2 weeks, though, that the placenta forms, and we can then clarify a shift to the embryotic or the embryo. This is going to last from about 2 weeks to 2 months. This is a particularly pivotal milestone because now, all of a sudden, this child is vulnerable to things such as drug use by the mother, alcohol use by the mother. So that formation of the placenta is a really significant milestone, something we'll talk about in the next upcoming slide. And then from 9 weeks all the way to birth is the fetus. The fetus is by far the longest stage in this development, 9 weeks all the way through birth. So we're talking about basically 2 months all the way up to 9 months. First concept related to prenatal development that we need to talk about is a concept called tetragens. These are chemical or viruses that are prominent during either the embryotic or the fetal stage that could potentially cause harm to the child, not only during the pregnancy, but certainly after birth as that child develops. Some of these can have significant impairments on childhood brain development. We're talking about things like radiation, drug use like alcohol or cocaine, and others, certainly alcohol abuse. We're talking about infections, so it could even be things like getting sick. One very common byproduct of alcohol abuse during pregnancy is a phenomenon called fetal alcohol syndrome. So there are really significant possible tetragens that could occur to the child during that 2 week all the way up through pregnancy phase of prenatal development. Once the child, though, is then born, we can then proceed and start to talk about some early infancy and childhood development phenomenons. The first of which is a concept known as maturation. Maturation is a term that we use for the natural biological growth processes that are going to occur, generally speaking, uninfluenced by experience, meaning these are the brain development changes that are going to occur on a pretty rigid timeline that are going to facilitate things like memory development, language development, movement development. Assuming the child is experiencing even basic interactions, the maturation process is going to occur. Now, of course, there are outliers. You might recall back in Unit 1, we talked about that case study of Jeannie, who essentially lived the entirety of her early years locked in a basement without any human contact. She never was able to acquire the skill of language. She could speak words, but she could never produce actual coherent linguistic classified examples of language. So although, yes, some of the biological growth process occurred, it certainly was influenced by personal experience because that's such an unusual circumstance. But generally speaking, individuals in their early years who are interacted with and spoken to are going to develop these very specific behaviors in a relatively uninfluenced timeline. One classic example of maturation, so this sort of brain development and growth that occurs at an early age, is the first few years of life exhibiting what's called infantile amnesia. You certainly are not going to be able to remember what happened your first or second year of life. Your first memory is probably going to happen sometime around the age of 3. Well, the result of that has to do with the hippocampus and the fact that the hippocampus is still actively developing during those early years. The hippocampus, a term that we identified back in Unit 1, a term that we essentially classified as the save button, the term that takes something out of short-term memory and then stores it into long-term memory. Another example of maturation beyond just memory are motor skills. There are 2 different classifications of motor skills that we exhibit: gross motor skills and fine motor skills. Gross motor skills are the large muscle movements that we produce. Like if we're going to talk about a newborn, we're talking about things like rolling over or sitting up or crawling or walking. These are things that are going to require large muscle movements. We're not talking about moving one finger. That's certainly not a large muscle movement. We're talking about utilizing muscles necessary to walk and run and kick something and throw something. The reason we're talking about this in the context of maturation is that the timeline for these large muscle movements is relatively set in stone. Someday you might be a parent and your child's going to walk around the age of 1. That's pretty typical because the maturation process to facilitate that human behavior is relatively uninfluenced by environment. It's pretty set in stone. There is a timeline for developing that skill. There's also a timeline for developing fine motor skills. There is a reason why the now defunct Toys R Us, I guess now the King Amazon, all of these stores that sell, for example, toys to children have recommended ages because there are certain fine motor skills that children can and cannot do. For example, within just a few months, the child starts to do what's called sort of the pincing, where they'll pick something up, but it'll almost be like they're pinching it with their thumb and their index finger. Children will have the ability to kind of grab their toys in a much more robust manner around the age of 1. You look at that picture there of a child using sort of this, sort of make-believe book that they're reading, sort of this picture book. And then as the child ages past the age of 1, certainly around 16 to 18 months, the child can start to use sort of versions of a sippy cup. They'll have the ability to actually hold something, hold it in their hand and not drop it. So the child is going to age through each of these either gross or fine motor skills. In a sense, we're talking about either big movement skills or those fine small skills like buttoning a shirt. Just to progress through this, I think it's interesting to see. You should expect someday that if you're a child, that your child begins to run at about the age of 2. You can start to use bikes around the age of 3. If you're familiar with childhood scissors, those are fairly difficult for children to use. And if you give a child who's 2 years old one of those, they're likely not going to be able to maneuver it. Those types of really fine skills necessary to scissor something is going to be apparent around the age of 3. Children being able to kick a soccer ball at the age of 4. There's a reason why youth soccer starts at about that age. There's no 1-year-old youth soccer, 2-year-old youth soccer. Just because a kid is walking and running doesn't necessarily mean they can kick the ball effectively. If you're familiar with the way children write, you obviously know it probably looks a lot like the picture to the right. The ability just to grasp a pen or a pencil or a marker is not something that's really fully developed, or at least not developed well enough to write until about the age of 4, and then that's going to continue to progress. Each of these are examples of fine or gross motor skills. One that the College Board typically likes to ask about is in this bottom right corner. Buttoning a shirt is one of the more challenging fine motor skills that a child accomplishes. I mean, there is a reason why, for example, children have Velcro shoes. Grasping the laces necessary to tie your shoe can be really challenging if you haven't developed those fine motor skills. So there is a reason why we have things like Velcro and very simple shirts to button. Children oftentimes at these early ages, through no fault of their own, simply cannot carry out the behaviors necessary to facilitate those types of clothing choices. Proceeding onward, we're going to talk a little bit about the term temperament. You should go home to a parent or guardian or somebody that was around you when you were a child and ask them, how would you describe my emotional behavioral pattern? What we see is that there are really 3 different types of emotional reactions and patterns in infants. Children who are easy, children who are slow to warm up, which might seem a little bit reserved, but can kind of teeter back and forth between these two depending on the circumstances, and then children who are simply difficult. And at the end of the day, you will love your child no matter what, but it would be quite a bit easier if you had a child that had an easy temperament. I would like you to watch the entirety of the video attached here on the left. I will include it on the Google Classroom so you can really see what I mean by an easy baby and a difficult baby. You'll see 2 mothers who certainly love their child, but in terms of the ease of parenting, dealing with the child getting into trouble or getting into a dangerous situation, the child who is exhibiting that easy temperament is certainly much, as the name kind of indicates, easier to work with. There are 2 remaining columns in this essential task, this one on reflexes, and then we'll proceed to habituation. Reflexes are automatic behaviors and responses that seem to, at some point in time, have been suited for human survival. It might not seem readily obvious right now what the survival benefit of any of these behaviors are, but again, we can't just think about modern human history. We need to think about the entirety of human history. So there is a point in time where set point theory was valuable, the notion that you gain weight back after you drop below a certain weight. And if you try and diet now, that's obviously frustrating, but that's sort of approaching that concept from a modern perspective. In the large-scale scope of human history, set point theory was probably beneficial. So we need to use that same type of mindset when talking about reflexes. The first reflex is called the rooting reflex. If you were to brush the cheek of a newborn, as you will clearly see in this video, that child will then move their face, open their mouth, essentially trying to obtain some type of food. So if you get a newborn infant and you brush them on the cheek, they will shift their face and open their mouth, seeking a source of food. It's called the rooting reflex. The Babinski reflex is an interesting one, and again, I want you to watch this video. If you were to sort of graze your finger along the bottom of a child's foot, you'll notice that their toes flare out and then curl back. We call this reflex the Babinski reflex. If you were to argue what the evolutionary benefit of this is, why this is sort of suited for survival, potentially there were time periods where you couldn't readily walk around or be placed into sort of the safe environments that children are often placed into now. And if a child were to place their foot onto something dangerous or sharp or harmful, then this would potentially save that child from any type of serious harm. When I look at the word Babinski, I look at the S, K, and I at the end, and I think of skiing. Skiing, you obviously need your feet. You need to put on the skis onto your feet. This is the only reflex that we're talking about today that is specifically related to the feet. So do copy down that mnemonic. I think it's a really effective one. The third mnemonic that is a video that I would like you to watch is called the Moreau reflex. This might sound weird, but if you kind of drop your baby, and I don't mean like drop your baby onto the ground, though they would probably still do this. I mean, take your baby, lift them up a few inches, lift him or her up, and gently drop them, bracing them for their fall or allowing them to fall onto a pillow. In either case, what you're going to see is their arms thrust out and their back arches out, sort of like a surprise. We call this the Moreau reflex. I kind of use a mnemonic. I call it the whoa reflex because the child is basically saying, whoa, what a surprise, you've dropped me. So I take the M and I flip it upside down into a W. So when I look at Moreau reflex, I always think of whoa. And if you watch that video, to me, it's quite memorable because that child definitely flares out exhibiting this. There are a handful of other human reflexes, but I'm just going to list them because they are exactly what they sound like. Rooting, Babinski, and Moreau are in and of themselves a little bit unique. The swallowing reflex, this is partially one of the reasons why you need to keep small toys away from children. Children at this age have what's called the swallowing reflex. So if you put food in their mouth, they're going to swallow it. They're going to know what to do with it. Unfortunately, that also applies to Lego pieces. So do be wary someday if you're a parent to avoid small objects around your child. The sucking reflex is really an obvious one. You can see this illustrated when the child is given a binky or a bottle. The grasping reflex, very simple. Place your finger into the palm of an infant and they'll grasp it. The last one, and this one might seem unusual, is called the swimming reflex. And I have to stress this, please do not submerge a child underwater and walk away. However, if in a controlled setting, you take a child, a newborn baby, and you submerge them underwater, they will know, due to a reflex, not to breathe in the water. They will not, at least initially, drown themselves. In addition, they will also kick out their arms and legs as if they were paddling or swimming underwater. Again, the videos that you're about to watch are extremely small windows of time. I am not saying you should go and submerge an infant underwater and walk away thinking that this child can swim. That's not the case. But there are infant swimming classes for precisely this reason. I would watch this video. It's actually hilarious to watch. The last term related to infancy and early development is a concept called habituation. This term applies to infants, but it also applies to people and to a certain degree can apply to other species like cats. This is the basic idea that if you were exposed to a stimuli again and again and again, eventually your reaction to it is going to diminish. So for example, if you buy a brand new toy for an infant, the color, the shape, how it feels, the tactile feeling, all of that will be brand new to the child. So for a period of time, that child is going to be really excited. Brand new toy, they're going to put it in their mouth, shake it if it's a rattle. However, after repeated exposures, they'll usually grow very bored of that toy. And the next thing you know, you have to buy a new toy or rotate toys in and out so that the child sees the toys less frequently. That's one sort of little parenting tip. You don't want to bombard your child with every single toy every day. Rotate them. The things will seem fresh to the child. You don't want the child to habituate regarding some of the toys that you buy them. This also applies, though, to adults, to children beyond just infants. For example, if there's a ticking clock in a room at your house, because every single day you hear that clock, it's more likely than not than you do not hear that anymore. You would have to stop and think, is there a clock going on right now? Oh, I do hear that. But typically you can go through your day, you can do your homework, you can watch TV, you can have a conversation, you can eat dinner, you can do all these behaviors because you've habituated to that ticking clock. Perhaps you have a roommate that's really loud in college. or at least plays music every night, and you think that music's relatively loud during the first couple weeks that you've been there. But by the end of the first month, the second month, you've habituated, you've gotten used to it. That repeated exposure no longer bothers you. We call this process habituation. I alluded to this also can work with pets. For example, my cat, you buy a new toy, you drop it down in front of him, he goes absolutely crazy. Within a week, that toy will sit there on the floor untouched. So what I typically do is I try to pick up those toys, put them into storage, and rotate his toys in and out. That way, the repeated exposure is no longer there. So he ends up seeing relatively new toys, or at least toys that he hasn't seen in a while. That way, he doesn't habituate to those toys. He sees toys that he hasn't seen in a while, and he finds them very exciting. So this term habituation can be applied to infants, which is the context that we're looking at here with the example. It, however, can also be applied to people at any age. Think about the ticking clock in the background, or theoretically, even animals. As a mnemonic, when I look at this term, I really isolate those first three letters, and I think of the phrase, I've had enough. Because that's really what this is. I've had enough. I've seen this toy 1,000 times. Please go buy a new toy, or please pick a different toy to use.